Good afternoon, everyone. Happy holidays. It's Susan Kaufman here for Attitude Magazine, our weekly ADHD Experts webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We're having a pretty special webinar for teachers of children with attention deficit disorder and learning disabilities. We're calling this an Educator's Guide to Teaching Children with ADHD and LD. Today's webinar topic was generated as a result of a poll that was put together by our speaker, Dr. Jerome Schultz, who I'll introduce in a minute, and Attitude, to ask teachers to share their top concerns about teaching children with ADHD and LD. And Dr. Schultz generously structured his presentation today around responses to the topics that teachers raised. Before we get going, I just want to mention that obviously many teachers cannot hear the live webinar today. It's in the middle of the school day, toward the end of school, before holiday season, but all of our webinars, and this one included, are available on replay. It's as if you were there, both the sound and the audio and the visual, through our website, attitudemag.com/webinars. So if you're a parent, I hope you'll share this with your teacher. If you're a teacher and you can't stay on, come back and listen to it when it's more convenient for you. We also have a podcast series on iTunes, which is just, I'm happy to say, reached its 2 millionth download. These are free podcasts that are made from the audio of our webinars, and this webinar also will be in the iTunes podcast ADHD Experts within a couple of weeks. It takes us a while to get them edited and put up. So with that, let me welcome Jerome Schultz, and let me just tell you briefly some of the topics that teachers raised. How to manage disruptive behavior in the classroom. This is one we've heard before. How to modify assignments to match the kids' learning styles and especially the needs of children with learning disabilities or ADHD. How to really implement IEP accommodations and 504 services during what for every teacher is a really busy and time-constrained day. How to explain ADHD to children's classmates and to parents, and how to defend kids when they're mislabeled. And finally, a topic that Dr. Schultz is extremely helpful on is the impact of stress and anxiety on learning and behavior in the classroom. So let me introduce you again to Dr. Jerome Schultz. We are so honored to have him. He is a clinical neuropsychologist for over 30 years on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry. He's a former middle school teacher himself, and he's the author of a really wonderful book called Nowhere to Hide: Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. For more information, you can go to his website, www.jeromeschultz.com, and I'll also tell you at the end of the webinar that he is willing to take some questions if we don't online, which we'll give you a link for that if we don't have time today to answer everyone's questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Schultz, for joining us today. Let me first now put up a poll to ask each of you to share, just for our own interest, your interest in this topic. Specifically, are you a teacher? What kind of a teacher or a parent? And while that poll is on, I will tell you a little bit about how our ADHD Experts podcast webinars work. You're all muted. You can post your questions for Dr. Schultz in the box on your screen, and he'll present his presentation first, and then he'll respond to questions. You may have problems hearing us, and if you do, it's almost entirely likely to be your internet line, and the best solution is to dial in via the phone line. You'll see a little toggle in your control panel that you can go to telephone. It'll give you a phone number. After the sessions, you'll find the slides as well as the audio, as I mentioned earlier, at attitudemag.com/webinars. And later, in a few weeks, you'll find the podcast in the iTunes store. So that is the summary of our organization. And let's see, did we give you enough time to tell us about your interests in this topic? Let's see, elementary school. Stuart, should we go ahead and show the results? Okay, all right. So we have some teachers who have made their way on here, which is great. 44% of you are parents, and 38% have some other interest in the topic. So that's really helpful. Thank you so much. So with that, let me turn this over to Dr. Schultz and let him start his presentation. Thank you.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be able to do this webinar and be involved with Attitude in this way. I don't yet have I'm still seeing the quick poll screen in front of me, so I don't have my slideshow back, so maybe we can push some buttons on your end and get me back in control of the PowerPoint presentation I have up. There we are. Looks like we're in the right place. Let me move ahead. And there we go. Looks like we're on site. Susan, can you see the screen that I have up, how to help kids with ADHD in the classroom?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, good. Then we're ready to roll. Welcome all the participants in the webinar today, and those of you who join us virtually later through the podcast. Happy to have the opportunity to talk with you about some things I feel very passionately about. I think the idea of getting questions in advance from teachers across the country is a really helpful way to set up a platform to deliver some concrete, practical information. I know a lot of you know a lot about ADHD, know a lot about learning disabilities. Most teachers I talk to say, okay, Dr. Schultz, tell me now what to do. I know enough about the conditions. So we're going to go through several of the questions that Susan previewed for you and try to give you the best of my thoughts about reasonable, practical answers to these questions. First question is how to manage disruptive behaviors in the classroom, and what are the best practices regarding discipline. And so my answer is couched in terms of discipline. You know, I have, if you've listened to me before, if you've read some of the things that I've written both for Attitude and other places, I've got a very strong feeling that a lot of the behaviors that we see in kids are due to, are really escape behaviors, where kids are really trapped in a situation over which they feel they have little control, and it's a natural thing for them to try to get out of the situation. And sometimes we see behavior that's inappropriate or disruptive to us. So I get a little bit uncomfortable when I start talking about discipline. So let me share with you some strategies that I think will help you look at this in a bit of a different way. I think when kids are engaged in tasks that they believe they can do, the negative behaviors decrease. That's important. I've talked before, and I'll repeat it again here, about the power of competence. If you are listening and you're an adult and you do something well, whether it's parenting or teaching or knitting or playing golf or whatever it is, you know that if you feel competent, that you don't have a lot of anxiety about that task. I think when kids feel like they're doing something in school that they believe they can do, the negative behaviors decrease, because if my hypothesis is right, those negative behaviors are escape behaviors. So piece of cake here means I want to get kids in a classroom and while they're doing homework at home to be able to look at something and say, I think I can do this. I believe I can do this. We've got a lot of kids across the country looking at a task and they're saying there's no way I can do this. And if that's the case, then their brain is responding in a way that's getting in the way of their learning. What I'm trying to say is here is my way of introducing a concept that every behavior sends a message. When kids do things, the behavior they exhibit is sending us an underlying message. And I think it's really important that we really be able to look at that behavior and understand it, read the need to meet the need. If kids do something like get out of their seat or say something rude or run out of the classroom, if you get that this behavior may be a sign that what they've been asked to do is too difficult, or if they're under a certain amount of stress or anxiety because of something toxic that happened to them in the class before or during the day before and the week before. Maybe there's something going on at home that's upsetting with them. If you look at their behavior as a way of them sending a message to you, if you know how to understand and read that message, then you can deal with it and help kids be successful. Asking kids what's going on may not be as fruitful as trying to know more about the child's environment, know more about what the class the child just went to, because often kids can't articulate what's getting in the way. They can just say to you, by their behavior or by their words, I'm not ready to do this. I can't do this right now. So giving them strategic timeouts may be helpful. If you look at the motivation for their behavior, here the yellow text you see on your screen says looking for love in all the wrong places. It's really about attention. What's the purpose or function of the behavior? It may be looking for love, but I think usually it's either looking for attention or recognition recognition or looking for ways to reduce the stimulation of the activity. If we think about the purpose or the function of the behavior that the child's exhibiting, and then give the kid another opportunity to meet that purpose, achieve that purpose in a more acceptable way, will eradicate a lot of the behavior. And the question won't be about discipline. It'll be about the joy of what we see kids doing. So is it a need for attention, recognition, stimulation, escape, entertainment? Are kids just trying to be funny? Often these behaviors are misread as oppositional and defiant behaviors or lack of motivation. I think those responses are very rare in kids. The ones you see on your screen in front of you are likely to be at this the cause of this problem. The function of the behavior, in my view, too, is to get out of a situation over which kids feel they have little or no control, or they don't feel like they're going to be competent. I don't care too much for money, because why? What does that mean? Sometimes we use behavioral approaches to get kids to do things. We offer them incentives, or we say, if you don't do something in a certain way, something good will be taken away from you. Those are effective behavioral practices, but if we've got the wrong strategy in place for this kid, the incentive won't do much good. If you as an adult, let's say, are afraid of swimming, if you don't swim, and I put you on the side of a pool in which the water is 15 feet deep, and I say, I'll give you $1,000 if you let me push you into that deep end, you might not even take the $1,000, because the incentive there is not going to match your fear. It's not going to override your fear. I like to say sometimes you can't M&M this underlying need out of a kid. You can't use behavior modification just to make the problem go away. The question here is there another way this need that the child is exhibiting can be met? Is there some other platform? If it's the need for attention, put the kid on stage. Let the kid tell a joke a day. Let the kid create a video that's funny and get attention in that way. But limit the amount of time a child has in the classroom to do that kind of on-stage behavior. But I think it'll go a long way if you let the child exhibit his need in a way that's acceptable to you as a teacher. Dennis the Menace famously said in one cartoon by Hank Ketchum, by the time I think about doing something, I already did it. Well, a lot of kids are impulsive as a part of their ADHD, so they say things, they blurt out things, they do things that they really haven't thought enough about yet. And I think you have to factor that in. It doesn't mean you can excuse the behavior, but it does mean that you can say, okay, Johnny, Susie, I understand that, and we've talked about this in private. I know you have a condition called ADHD. I know that impulsivity is a part of your profile. You've just done something right now that's impulsive. Would you like to fix it? Give kids a chance to repair things they've done impulsively, because that's part of this condition. Over time, they'll get better at this, but sometimes they engage their mouths before their brains are in gear, and then they look silly, they feel silly, and then the next thing you see is a behavior that's trying to cover up the embarrassment that they feel. So think about that when you're working with kids. The other question that came up, next question that came up, was how can I create and modify assignments to match the learning style and the needs of kids with ADHD? Well, that's the goal, isn't it, of creating an accessible classroom where differentiated instruction is happening. How do I create and modify assignments to match that need? We talked just a moment ago about kids who are impulsive, which is one of the hallmark characteristics of ADHD. If you're impulsive and right, you're a winner. If you do things quickly without a lot of thinking, but you're generally right, you're a winner. So you try to give kids the answers to questions in advance, or give them the chance to find the answer to a question in advance, so the content that's behind their tongue, the contents in their brain, is going to come out right instead of coming out wrong. Thinking on your feet is an asset for all of us as individuals. These kids do it really well. Kids with ADHD are often hired because of the combination of being impulsive. That is, they don't wait around to think about the consequences, but they're really, really bright, so they say things that really help move a project along or an idea along. If you're not sure that they've got the content that's going to help them, you have to give kids a chance to stop and think about what they're going to say. And you can say that directly. I'm going to ask you guys a question that's really important, but before you blurt out an answer, any of you, I want you to think about it and raise your hand. Let me know when you're ready to give an answer. That's a way to kind of stop that impulsive train from coming down the track too fast. You can do what I call buddy checks. We also use the term think, pair, and share. or turning to your study partner. You say, kids, I'm going to ask you a question that's really important. The answer is important for you to have. Turn to somebody to the left or the right of you. Turn to your study partner and find out what they have. Share your idea with them before you go public. It's another way to get a slight delay, like you might have on a radio or TV program where the voice that goes out to the audience is delayed in case the host does something or says something that's not right. We don't have that feature on this webinar, so I have to be careful about what I say here. What about kids who are hyperactive? Kids who are overactive? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but giving kids a chance to be active on something that serves a good purpose is an important thing to do. Stand and learn, move around, jump around to rhythm, calling out the multiplication tables, giving kids a chance to use their energy. I don't regard hyperactivity in a kid with ADHD as excessive energy. I regard it as kind of a cognitive and behavioral style. But let kids move to rhythm. Let kids move while they're reciting dates in history. Let kids stand up and sit down when they get an idea or when they need more help. Purposeful movement is the key. The other thing is to do what I might call student research. You say to kids, during this next activity, I'm going to not only let you move, but I'm going to encourage you to move. And when we finish this, I want you to tell me whether or not this movement helped you learn or helped you demonstrate knowledge that you have. When kids see the connection between movement and productive behavior, movement doesn't become a bad thing. It becomes an asset that they can use. What about kids who are inattentive as part of their profile? To be able to stand up and deliver a message is a way to help assuage or control inattention. If you're standing and your body's physically alert and you're having to stand, or standing on one foot also is a good way to do that, or standing with one arm up in the air. When you move your body and hold it in a position, your brain is engaged in a different way than it might be if you're sitting in a chair passively. These kids spend a lot of time in American schools sitting, listening, and then responding, and that's just can become a vacuum for these kids to lose track with what's going on and pay attention to other things that are more salient, more interesting to them. Having kids close their eyes and try to visualize a scene is another way to help focus attention. So you're sitting in front of a class of 26 or 36 kids, it doesn't really matter, and you say, kids, I want you to close your eyes. I'm going to describe a scene to you, and I want you to raise your hand when you think you see that scene. You know, whether it's a scene from history or whether it's a number scene that they're seeing and that they're visualizing in math, whether it's a word that's broken into 3 parts. Get kids to put that image on their internal visual screen by closing their eyes and let you know when they get there. You have to tell them to let you know when they get there, because they may close their eyes and doze off or go into some other la-la land. We don't want that to happen. But the idea of closing your eyes cuts out visual stimuli that can distract kids. I was talking to a group of teachers yesterday in a program I'm doing in Colorado, and they built a new school that has a beautiful view of the mountains out the back of the window, and the teachers are complaining because kids are looking out the window. I think teachers are looking out the window because it sounds like a pretty beautiful view from there. But I think if you, I said to them, pull the shades halfway up from the bottom so you can look out the top and not be distracted by things going by like bears and deer and rabbits and things like that. But closing your eyes is one way to cut off that stimuli. Hold your hands up like an antenna, kids. Put your hand up, and when you get the message I'm sending, put your hand down. And that sounds like more like a little kid activity, but if you do it metaphorically, you can say you can do it in a different way with older kids. You can say, put your hand on your desk and put your thumb up. And when I see the thumbs going down, I know that you get that message. It's a little more of a mature activity, but still using the body like an antenna. Stand up when you get the message, sit down. Put your hand up when you get the message, put your hand down, and so forth. When you get the message, turn to somebody else and tell them what you heard. All these are good ways to modify assignments to help kids be successful. We know too that there's a 30 to 50% overlap of ADHD with learning disabilities. So if kids have a learning disability in addition to ADHD, we can use what I'm calling the IKEA tool list. When you buy something from IKEA, you pull out a piece of paper and it says to you, in order for you to put this desk together. You need these tools. You need to follow these directions. You know as well as I do, if you don't have those tools and you don't use them, that desk goes together with a missing piece on the floor when you're done, and it's more likely to fall apart. So a tool list for kids is, what do you have in your toolbox to help you do this activity? And it's not about us always giving the kids the toolbox, but after we give it to them a couple times, we have to say to them, do you have what you need in your toolbox right now for this activity? We have to have them monitor their own behavior, their own ability to reach into their toolbox and get what they need. So what if a child doesn't have skills developed at the level that allows him or her to work on this activity? So some kids spend time in a learning center. Some kids spend time outside of a general education classroom developing their skills so that they can finally get skills at a level that will help them work in prime time in the classroom. If their skills aren't developed at the level that let them do the task that you ask them, they're going to be behind the eight ball. It's going to be a setup for frustration and failure. They also need to know how to work around these difficulties, and that's where the modifications come in. If these kids have dyslexia and reading is hard, reading a print page is hard, if you have materials that are on recorded books or through Learning Ally, or you make recordings of books beforehand, or the kids make recordings of books beforehand. They don't have to be bogged down in an area in which they have poor skills, that is reading. They can listen to the material. Their brains are smart. Their ears work well. So that's another kind of modification you have to think about. Here's another question that came up from the teachers in the national audience. How do ADHD and learning disabilities overlap? I mentioned in the last slide that it's usually thought that there's a 30 to 50% overlap, or what's called comorbidity, of ADHD and learning disabilities, and it works both ways. The thing to remember in this case is, because these conditions often live in one individual, one of these conditions affects the other. A kid with ADHD may have behaviors that look like learning disability, and a kid with a learning disability may have those weaknesses exacerbated or made worse by the presence of inattention. The filters created by a learning disability can look like attention problems. That's an important thing to remember. So before we rush to judgment about a diagnosis of ADHD, let's look at the processing that's involved. ADHD can cause difficulties that look like learning disabilities. They can cause memory problems. They can cause attention problems, and it looks like kids are having difficulty processing when it really might be that they have difficulty paying attention or focusing attention. So a good multidisciplinary assessment by a psychologist or a neuropsychologist is really helpful here. Someone or a team of people who can clarify the overlap that exists between these two conditions and then offer suggestions that will help with both conditions. If you have strategies that help with the ADD component in a child, then that's going to help the learning disability and vice versa. So the two conditions coexisting in one individual have an overlapping impact. We have to treat both of those by interventions in both of those domains. Medication, as we know, may help some kids with ADHD symptoms. There's usually a very high statistic given to the fact that medication can be helpful when a condition is primarily when it's appropriately diagnosed, and when the medication is appropriately dosed. There are estimates that say 75 to 80% of the kids with ADHD are helped by appropriate dosage of medication. The opposite is not true of learning disabilities. Medication is not going to help a learning disability. But again, you can see how if you have a kid who has the combination of ADHD and LD, that medication may be a way to lessen the impact of the ADHD, at least temporarily, till the kid gets the skills he or she needs to be instructed. So that relates to the next comment here. We need, for kids with learning disabilities, they need to have specialized and intensive instruction, as well as modifications in the classroom. A student with severe learning disabilities like dyslexia who doesn't get the appropriate and intensive instruction in reading won't do well. Will look like a kid with attention deficit problems, will try to get out of a classroom or try to get out activities. So we have to think about how we build up the skills so that the toolbox is filled with the things that the kid needs to be successful. Meditation may be may be beneficial for both learning disabilities and ADHD. And a lot of you are working in schools, or parents are familiar with schools that are using mindfulness practices. That's a form of meditative practice that helps kids be more thoughtful about what they're doing, help them be more thoughtful about the executive strategies that they're going to use to be successful, and so forth. So meditation is proving beneficial for a lot of kids with learning challenges and attention challenges. Another question that came up in the survey was, what's the impact of stress and anxiety on learning and behavior in kids with ADHD? And as Susan said to you, this is kind of my sweet spot. I'm doing a lot of writing and traveling and speaking about the impact of stress and anxiety on learning and behavior and emotions of kids, because to me, it's the missing piece of the puzzle. The answer for me is here: kids who don't feel they can be competent are under chronic stress. That's my hypothesis here. They're looking for the exit sign. These are kids are looking for a way out of an activity that they don't feel that they can do at all or do well, as a way to get out of a situation that makes them embarrassing and makes them feel like failure. When kids are under a high level of stress or anxiety because of their worries about their ability to do the task, this automatically triggers in the brain an academic fight, freeze, or flight response. That means that the fear factor section of the brain, it gets activated, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a little bit, and the executive function part, or the thinking part of the brain, shuts down in the service of survival. When the survival brain is activated by the stress response, this is what scientists and psychologists call the HPA axis, and that has to do with the part of the brain that is responsible for stress. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for the executive functions, thinking about thinking, planning, organizing yourself so that you can be more successful. Under stress, when this survival part of the brain is activated, when the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenal glands are activated, and the brain starts pumping out stress-related chemicals, the frontal part of the brain shuts down, and it's a setup for failure and frustration. So because this is biologically true, it's just not an attitude that kids have. They don't say, I feel stress. Their brain is under pressure that wants to be resolved. The brain likes to be in balance. So these are kids who are just thinking about running. They're not thinking about thinking. We're built biologically with the ability to escape danger by having our brain and our body respond to danger in a different way from that which we respond to competence. And it's important to think about that when kids are in school. Here's a picture, a cutaway view of the brain. If you look at the left-hand side of this picture in the grayed out area that says executive functioning area, that's the prefrontal cortex. And that's the area where the executive functions live. In the middle of the brain, where you see that coral-colored circle, you see the fight or flight areas of the brain, these subcortical areas. When danger comes, these are the areas that pick this up. And they say to the executive functioning areas, don't think about this, just get the heck out of here. So I'm making the case that when kids are in school, sitting day after day in an environment in which they don't believe they can be successful, that is because they have reading difficulties or attention problems or math difficulties, if they don't think they can be successful, they're scared. Even if we say, honey, I know you can do this, I believe in you, it doesn't matter. If you're standing next to that pool filled with 15 feet of water and I say, you know what, I believe that you will survive this, so let me push you into the pool. You're not listening to me. You're trying to run away from me. You're not thinking about how what I'm saying might be possible. So kids' perception rules in this case because of what's happening in the brain. Stress has an important immediate impact on kids functioning. Kids who are under stress, whether it's external stress, the kind of stress that many of us feel just because of the daily activities we're involved in our lives, or it's the stress that comes from not feeling like you're able to do a task that's put before you. Both short-term memory and long-term memory get affected. If you think about this, the stress comes on, your brain is scared. It's looking for the exit sign. It's looking for the door. It's looking to get to a place where it feels competent and confident. Your short-term memory starts to suffer because what's being taught to you doesn't go into your brain. If it doesn't go into your short-term brain, it doesn't make its way to your long-term memory. We actually have two types of receptors that are in our brain. One's responsible for catching the information coming in, this type 1 receptor that you see here, and the other type of receptor is responsible for turning that short-term memory into long-term storage so we can retrieve it later on. This, incidentally, as you see the resource on the bottom, comes from the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, who's worked intensely with kids who have been in traumatic situations. And if you want to learn more about this, you can go to his website called childtrauma.org. The cumulative effects of this stress builds up over time, and it affects the way the brain functions, it affects the way we feel about our work, and it affects our behavior. This is important. Think about this. Under continuous or traumatic stress, there's a greater concentration of growth in the cells that are in the midbrain. Remember that coral circle that I showed you a couple slides back? That's where the emotions live. That's where the survival mechanisms live. That's the part of our brain that increases our heart rate when we're under stress, that dilates our eyes so we can see better in dark if we're facing a danger in the dark, that regulates our blood flow, takes blood away from our stomach, for example, and sends it to our legs, because we don't need to worry about digesting food, but we do need to worry about running. If you think about that, under stress, those parts of the brain that you need to get out of those stressful situations get stronger. They get bigger. There are actually more brain cells or larger cells in that area of the brain. Correspondingly, as I mentioned earlier, we have fewer brain cells or weaker connections in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So we have an impairment in what are called the executive functionings, or our ability to think about things on a higher level. It's a biological reality. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we're missing the boat here. If we just think it's about attitude, we're barking up the wrong tree. What else is interesting, when kids are under stress, they have an underdeveloped capacity for empathy. When they've experienced trauma in their lives, they're thinking about survival. Think about it this way. If you're in prehistoric times and you're living in a cave and a saber-toothed tiger comes to the door of your cave, your family is behind you, cowering in fear. You care about your family, but you're not really thinking too much about how they feel. You're thinking about how to get rid of that tiger, how to slay the demon. And if that's the case, if your survival brain and the part of your brain that's responsible for making the danger go away is working on a high level, you don't stop to think about things too much. You don't worry about other people who are with you, but you worry about saving your own life so that then later you can worry about people who are around you. That's where the biological roots of this come into play. The other thing that's interesting about this phenomenon, this biological phenomenon, this HPA axis, that when it's activated a lot, these kids become hypersensitive to cues of what are called perceived threats. If they're looking for things that look like, smell like, sound like, anything that scared them before. So they've got this quick trigger response for survival behaviors. So if you open a book in a classroom, a kid with dyslexia who hasn't learned to master her dyslexia is looking at that book as a toxic stimulus. She's going to say, uh-oh, here comes trouble. And her brain is primed to respond to that in the same way as if the book were a saber-toothed tiger. These are the kids who are under chronic stress, or kids who have experienced traumatic stress, are likely to be impulsive. Think about that. Overdiagnosis of ADHD caused by a lack of our willingness to look at this as a possible reaction to stress. These are kids who might be more aggressive, kids who act out, who reach out and touch other people in inappropriate ways, or kids who become withdrawn, or kids who become depressed. All these are possible consequences of being in a traumatic stress situation or in a chronic stress situation. The mechanisms are the same. The next question that came up is one that says, how to explain ADHD to a child's classmates and to their parents, or defend this child when those people are labeling him as naughty or saying he's taking up too much of the teacher's time. First of all, I think, and this is part of the de-stress model that I talk about in my book, we have to help kids learn about their own condition. If kids have the ability to describe their own learning profile, whether it involves learning difficulties and learning challenges or attention challenges. The more kids know about their own learning and the better they can articulate it to other people, you don't have to defend this kid against anybody, because this kid is standing up and saying things, like, I have this condition. For some people it's a disability. For me it's a challenge. I don't let it get me down, but there may be certain behaviors that I exhibit from time to time that are related to my disability. I'm not using this as an excuse, folks, but I'm just telling you about the reality. And when kids can stand up for themselves and self-advocate, there's less likelihood that other kids, classmates, and other people outside the school are going to ask questions about this. We can have kids make a drawing of themselves representing their strengths and weaknesses. We can have them make a YouTube-type video starring them either looking impulsive and then looking controlled, which is a really good intervention technique too, to have these kids act out appropriate educational behavior and inappropriate behavior and laugh about the difference. We can have kids be the star of their own comic books. We can download comic book making software from the internet and star these kids in their own story of stress and coping and competence. We can have kids who are older write an essay which they get credit for in their English class or in their college entrance materials. We can have kids make a PowerPoint that tell their story. If they can tell their story to somebody else, it means they understand their condition a lot better. All these means of explaining your condition are underscoring this theme about how I make my ADHD or my LD work for me, why it's not a disability. It's a condition I have, but why I'm putting all this energy and all these challenges to good work for me. And in any of these personal appeals have to include why the ADHD is an asset, when it's an asset, when it's a liability, and what I do about it. Attitude created a slideshow that's available on the AttitudeMagazine.com website called 17 Things I Love About ADHD. It's a great compilation of positive attributes and a lot of strengths, including a couple like this one. I have the ability to focus very intently on things. I have resilience that gets stronger by overcoming challenging. I'm a nice, funny person. I have a sparkling personality. I'm bright and creative and funny. I'm willing to take a risk. I have spontaneity, and a lot of others. So if you're trying to help kids build their own self-awareness, this attitude slideshow will help them. They can create one just like it for themselves, or they can borrow from that one. I also encourage you to borrow the language of my friend and colleague Ned Hallowell. If you remember, he's the psychiatrist who wrote the book along with John Ratey called Driven to Distraction, in addition to many other publications and webinars. And Ned says he thinks about ADHD not as a disability or as a deficit, but rather as a trait, a way of being, he eloquently says. It's characterized by a host of qualities, some positive, some negative. And that's his basis for working with kids. I've put in Dr. Hallowell's website here, and there's a part of that website that's called Top 10 Questions. You'll find some more of that language that you can be able to use with kids in your classroom or at home if you're a parent tuning in. In these self-appraisal devices that I talked to you about on the previous slide, these ought to include a description of what might get in the way. And depending on the developmental level of kids, you can talk about bumps or hurdles or impediments, and then what this child does to overcome those bumps or hurdles, how you work around or strengthen your weaknesses, and show the child who's able to show evidence of how these techniques and strategies are working are also strengthened by this, both in terms of their external PR and their internal self-awareness. For kids who can say, I'm not doing so well on this thing, but I'm making progress in this other thing. So, it's a journey, and I'm on that journey, and I just want you to know that. These personal essays or personal PR products should include what the child with the condition needs from adults. Parents, in order for me to maximize my success, to be more independent, I need this from you. And to you, my dear teachers, these are things that I need from you. If you give me these, I'm going to give a lot from myself, but I may not be able to do all these alone. And these personal statements ought to conclude with a language that's hopeful and optimistic. For example, I want you to know that I'm working hard. I know sometimes I can be annoying, but I'm not looking here for your forgiveness or a free pass. I'm just looking for your understanding. These personal testimonials are really hard for people outside the classroom to ignore, and they strengthen the kid from the inside out when we can get these done. We can help kids create these. Next question is, I know I'm moving pretty quickly here, but I want to make sure we get all through these things in the time that we have, so I'm going to keep plugging along. The question here is, how can I effectively implement IEP and 504 plans and all the accommodations they require during a busy day? I have great empathy for classroom teachers who are expected to do a lot of things for a lot of kids. They're forever dealing with new initiatives, how I teach reading, how I teach math, and even a new mental health curriculum that's superimposed on top of everything else you have to do. So how do you, in fact, implement IEP and 504 plans? There's a proverb that says, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I looked into that a little bit, and what it means to me is, when you look into that phrase, what it means is if you're cooking goose, it doesn't matter about the sauce you use. It's good for the goose and for the gander. An interesting, curious bit of culinary history, but I won't dwell on that. What my proverb, which is grows out of this old proverb, is what's necessary for the few is good for the many. So what we do for a few kids is going to help most other kids in our classroom. I always say that good special education is good education for gifted and talented children, because you're addressing kids on an individual level, you're differentiating instruction, the philosophy behind it is really good. So if you're implementing the goals and objectives and the strategies called for or mandated in an IEP or a 504 plan, they will certainly help the few kids who need these specifically, but they're going to do no harm for the other kids. So I think the answer is how to effectively manage these and implement these services is to try to weave them naturally into the delivery of instruction that you're doing anyway, to blend them into it so they're there, and you could substantiate the fact that you're living up to the promise of the IEP or the 504 plan, but you're doing it in a way that's not so obvious to the outside onlooker, but certainly integrated into your program. I agree that differentiated instruction is very hard in contemporary classrooms because there's so much of a focus now on meeting curriculum standards by a certain deadline. I can't make that go away. I'd like to be able to make that go away, but I think but it's a reality that we have to live with. Teachers are judged by their ability to deliver a certain body of knowledge in a certain amount of time, and that's a situation that it might have improved the performance of a lot of kids across the country if we're thinking about in terms of national norms, but it puts teachers and kids under a lot of pressure, which I think gets in the way of learning. That's my bias, but again, it's a reality that we have to live with. Weaving in these mental health strategies and weaving in social and emotional learning skills within a curriculum, an academic curriculum that's being delivered, that's the challenge of teaching today. I think, though, that all kids will meet these intense curriculum deadlines faster and more effectively when a teacher engages their kids in their own learning and when he or she embeds social and emotional learning strategies into the curriculum. And I think that's a challenge, but it's one that I think will help meet the demands on both sides of this coin. So I talked to you about having practical strategies, and I know you're asking, okay, great for you to say this, Dr. Schultz, but how do I do that? How do I get to that? A universally applied and helpful strategy that can meet the needs of some kids while meeting the needs of all kids can be modeled in this kind of dialogue. You say, if you're a classroom teacher, you say, hey kids, nice to see you again, glad to have you in the class, looking forward to what's going on. Here's our tasks for today, or here's our objective for this week or for this next period of time. Let's do this first thing together. Let's really work together to do the first one, because if I know that if I help you prime your brain, if I help you prime the prompt for learning, what comes next is going to be easier and more pleasant. So let's establish a baseline of competence here. And I like to say to teachers, ask kids this question: how difficult do you think this will be for you? And we use scales in a lot of ways in education. If you think about a 5-point scale here being the fingers on your hand, a really difficult task is when a kid holds up 5 fingers and says, wow, that's really difficult, kind of in your face. That's an important question to ask. If a teacher sees that 3 or 5 or 10 kids in the class think this is very, very difficult, doesn't mean you have to make it easier. But then you ask the question, how able do you think you are to do this? Use that same scale again. So here, if you have a 5, what I call a 5-1 combination is really good. 5 means the kid is saying to you, that's difficult, and a 1 or a thumbs up, that's the 1, means I can do this thing. That's the definition of competence. That's the definition of somebody conquering a difficult task. What I worry about is a 5-5 combination. Kid holds up his hand and says, this is way, 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 way difficult. And then how able am I to do this? That's also a 5. I don't think I can do this at all. Those are the kids that you need to differentiate your instruction and your attention for, because those are the kids who are saying to you, I'm stumped here. I'm stopped. Those are the kids whose brain are most likely in fight or flight mode. The other question to ask kids at this juncture is, how independently will you be able to do this task that I've put before you? How much can you do it by yourself, and how much will you need my help for? And also ask, will you be able to use your study buddy, your partner, somebody next to you? Collaborative learning, learning with and from other people, cooperative or collaborative learning, is a good way to get kids over these initial hurdles. Opening a book or an activity and saying, kids, okay, get to work on this, you could have half your class or more being stuck and being stumped. And those kids are going to have brains that are looking for a way out, not a way in. You can also ask kids this question: do you need any special equipment? Do you need a book on tape? Do you need a computer? Do you need earphones that keep sounds out of the room? Do you need to work in a study carrel that cuts off stimulation for you? This is the part where you can normalize some of those things that are in an IEP. You know, that the child will have sound deadening earphones that he wears in the classroom. If those are available to all kids who need them, and they see the connection between less auditory input and higher cognitive functioning, then these things cease being special. They're just tools that you use to allow you to be more successful. You can also ask this: if you believe you'll need my help with this, let me know in a certain way. For little kids, you can say, put a red token on the desk. I'll be over as soon as I can. If you raise your hand, that's certainly one way of doing it. But let kids know that if they need your help, you'll get to them. You can use a 2-color system in this way. You can say, put a green token. All kids can have these in their desk if they're little kids. Put a green token on your desk. That means you need a little help, but you've got something to do in the meantime until I come to get to you. If you put a red token, it means you're dead in the water. It means you can't take a step farther without my assistance. I'm going to be looking for, if you're a teacher, you say, I'm going to be looking for those color cues. I'm sorry. This assumes that kids on IEPs and 504 plans are educated about their own special needs. They're educated about what's supposed to be done to support them, and they're educated about what they should be doing to help themselves achieve. This often doesn't happen. If IEPs and 504 plans are just documents that end up in a child's folder or show up in an IEP or a 504 meeting, they're not being used in a way that can fully be used. I just talked to some teachers yesterday who are having kids in as early as 3rd grade run their own IEP meetings in a public school out west. That's a pretty nice thing, and they're groomed and taught how to do it. As a part of that, they're educated about their condition or their disability. They're educated about their self-advocacy skills. They're showing those PowerPoints or reading those essays that I talked to you about earlier. If we engage kids as their own advocates, a lot of these things will be less necessary. Another question: I'm concerned about the primarily inattentive kids who fall through the cracks. Because these students who have ADHD inattentive type are not disruptive, it's easier to ignore their unique needs. What can I do in the classroom to help? And I've given you some suggestions already, but here are some other ones. Close your eyes, kids. I'm going to talk to you. Clear your brain. That's a conscious effort to say, make your slate clean for what's coming next. Put this scene in your head. Raise a finger when you do this. If kids are inattentive, these and the other physical strategies that I talked to you about earlier can help with this problem. You can create activities that demand more attention. Physical engagement, for example, measuring something, walking out a shape in geometry on the floor, holding hands to form a shape by making human bodies into the shape, engaging large motor systems versus sitting around and writing at your desk. Collaborative writing helps some kids. What I mean by that is you have a story starter. One kid writes something or dictates something about the story, passes that piece of information to another kid sitting across or next to him. They add to the story, passing it back and forth. If you have kids who get out of attention by writing their own essay. Having kids share an essay and trade back and forth yields a really funny or interesting or more creative product, but it also gets kids more connected cognitively to the task. I've talked to you before earlier about think, pair, share, turn and learn, learning buddy. Engaging kids in cooperative and collaborative learning is one very easy way to help kids stay focused. And when kids are isolated in their own learning, when they're in their own corners trying to figure things out, that's a time when attention can wane and attention can drift. Ask kids frequently, is your brain engaged? And I've said this before and I'll reiterate it here. Stand up until you understand what you need to do. Sit down and get to work. Those physical cues that kids are really connected to you rather than assuming that they're with you in this task. Say to the class, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure you know the answer to. And I wrote that specifically in that way. This reduces the stress response. If you say, I'm sure you know the answer to this, they're more likely to be engaged. Some kids might say, oh yeah, she always says that, or he always says that, so I know that's a trick question. I'm not going to. Some kids, you can't control what they think, but if you set the stage for success, it certainly helps. You say to kids, when you have an answer in your head, put your hand up or turn to a partner, share the answer. Borrow his answer if you don't have one yet. This is another thing. If you're working collaboratively in a workplace and you don't have a solution to the workplace problem, good administrators, good bosses put people together to say, put your heads together and come up with one or two good solutions. Borrowing answers from other people is a good thing. And if you have kids who don't ever get to contribute, they're always borrowing rather than not giving, seed them a little bit before the class. Say, I'm going to be putting you in the situation where you're going to turn and learn with somebody else. I want you to tell me here in the privacy of the hallway or of my teaching office, what are some answers you might give to this question? Prime the pump a little bit so when you ask the question in class, this kid won't be overwhelmed by the anxiety of fear, but will be able to share the answer and feel good about it and look good about it for the same reason. What are some practical strategies that I can use to facilitate positive social interactions between students? Here are some things that I think are watchwords for this in terms of practical strategies. Don't set kids up for failure by putting them in situations that are too ambiguous. To say, okay, kids, I want you to sit down and use these materials and come up with a new game. Kids who are not sure their learning abilities get nervous in situations like that, or they get off task. Or you say to kids, let's play a new game where you don't know the rules. You're going to learn the rules as you go along. That's ambiguous. Or, okay, kids, let's do something on the playground. Let's play this game that has only a few rules, but for these kids, chaos may rule. So make sure that the rules and the steps that need to be taken are clear, are written down, are understood by kids. Ambiguity breeds anxiety. For some kids, it's exciting. For others, it's brain numbing. Don't put kids in situations that are too stimulating. We send kids out to recess and we wonder why they're always getting into trouble. There's so much going on, so many places to get into trouble. Free play during the classroom if you have. I like to believe that you have some time for free play in the classroom with all the demands that are placed on teachers and kids today. But if there is free play, that's a time that's both anxiety producing because it's too stimulating and it's also ambiguous, especially for kids who have social misperception difficulties. Physical education games that are less structured, like dodgeball, miserable situation for a lot of these kids to be in. Don't put them in situations that are too competitive unless you know that they can compete. If you ask kids to do things that are likely to put their weaknesses in the spotlight, like being paired with a super talented kid, these are kids who are likely to shut down. Give kids short-term collaborative tasks that are within their ability range. Start the activity for everyone with what I call an asset liability assessment. What do you bring to this that's going to help you be successful? What do you bring to this that might get in your way? How do you strengthen your strengths? And how do you get around the liabilities? How do you lessen the likelihood that you're going to make a mistake during this task? Pair kids according to their temperament or their learning style. If there's a mismatch there, it's going to set up some tension between the kids, and there are great rating scales that look at learning style. I don't have references for you now, but if you look at learning style inventories online, you come up with a lot of things that can be helpful in this regard. After kids did an activity, help them evaluate those afterwards. You say to say things like this to them. What did Yvonne do that was helpful to you today? Or is there anything David could have done differently that would have helped you achieve the goal, would have made the activity more fun, would have made this whole thing better for you? Can you agree to try these things next time? Post-activity evaluations are a good way to have kids look back at what just happened, learn from it, and move that strategy forward to the next time. How to best work with parents of kids with ADHD. What are some guidelines for parent conferences, parent-teacher conferences? I know we have a significant group of parents listening today. I'd be interested to know if these things make sense to you. Parents are at a different stage of understanding about their child's differences. Some of them don't want to use the disability labels that have been given to their kids. Some of them may say, well, I think this is something he'll outgrow, or she just has to get tough at this. Parents are at parents' perception of their kids' problems and their ability to deal with it are on a continuum. And if teachers don't understand where parents are on that continuum, they may start too high or too low on that scale. Parents, you can talk to your kids' teachers about where you are on that continuum of understanding, letting them know that you might even have more information that they have about your kids, or you may need to know more information, and asking them how they can help you learn more information and vice versa. Not all people who are adults who are in a parenting situation may be in agreement about the diagnosis. They may have different opinions within one family or the approach to helping kids. We have to know that if we're really trying to best work with parents and have a good parent-school dialogue. Many parents have a negative history with the school. A lot of these conditions that we're talking about have biologic genetic roots. If conferences in school have focused on weaknesses and problems, a lot of parents don't want to go in and hear that over again. The other thing is they may have had negative relationships with the school themselves. They may have found learning challenging. So the idea of a school conference is not a benign activity. Before any formal IEP meetings, and certainly before bad news conferences or bad news meetings, hold what some people call listening conferences, during which time the parents can tell you their family's story. This is not a time to share information about the child in the classroom if you're a teacher, but this is a time for parents to share their perceptions of their child, including his or her strengths. This is a time when parents can tell you what has been helpful in the past or not helpful in the past. This is a time when parents can tell teachers how much or how little they'd like to be involved in their kids' education, or what might get in the way. They may say, I'd really like to be involved a lot, but I'm holding 3 jobs to put food on the table. So understand that I'm a highly involved parent, but I don't have a lot of time to do everything that you might expect me to do. It's also a time for you as a teacher to talk about your philosophy and your approach, so the parents can understand what page you're on, so to speak, and get on the same page. If a face-to-face meeting can't happen with parents, try to write to them in a letter. Some parents have made a video of their family or interviewing one parent or the other for teachers to watch. You can do a video conference session if your school allows that to happen. There are different ways that are in addition to or instead of having a parent come to school for a meeting that may not be easy for them. Also, don't forget to reach out to the non-primary parent. A lot of times mothers have the duty or the responsibility of talking to teachers. Fathers may have a lot of good ideas. It may be a father who has primary contact. Just don't ignore or neglect the input of the other person, because they have a different perception and much valuable information that they can add to this. And also, I want to encourage you to make frequent good news calls. Hey, Mrs. Johnson, I'm just calling you to tell you what a wonderful thing Billy did today. Parents aren't used to hearing those calls, and kids do good things all the time. It's really nice to let parents know when those things happen. Well, I think I got in just under the wire here with 2 minutes to spare. That's the end of the formal presentation, so we won't have a lot of time for dialogue, but I want to encourage you to contact, and I think Susan's going to take back over and give you some information about how to follow up on this, but there are some ways to contact me here. I'm going to invite you to follow me on Twitter, go to my blog on Huffington Post and see some things I write about special education and other things. And if you have the opportunity to take a look at my book, I would appreciate that. It's now available from Learning Ally in recorded form for those of you who don't read as well as you'd like to read in print. That's it. Susan, back to you.
Dr. Schultz, just a stunning amount of great information there. I know everyone's desperately trying to process it. Fantastic. People are commenting fantastic.
Thank you.
One thing I wanted to say to the listeners, I know many of you have very specific questions that relate to your child's or your classroom. And Dr. Schultz has very kindly agreed to take to answer some of the questions that he doesn't have time for today in our 1 hour. So I'm going to invite you to go back to the webinar sign-up page, attitudemag.com/webinars. Go to the page that announces Dr. Schultz's webinar, and at the bottom you'll see a question field for inviting you to ask questions. If you ask your questions there, we will give Dr. Schultz access to that page so that he can post his answers there. I think that's just a great way for everyone to share in their thinking and response to this extremely provocative and helpful presentation by Dr. Schultz. And again, let me repeat the name of his book. I can't stress highly enough how helpful this book is. Nowhere to Hide: Why Kids with ADHD and LD Hate School and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Schultz, I assume that's available on Amazon, right?
It sure is, yeah.
Yeah. For everyone, I wish you a happy holiday, and we'll be back with ADHD Experts webinars in January. At the moment, we have one lined up on something super interesting, which is nonverbal learning disabilities, a very little known and pretty important LD that is often confused and overlaps with ADHD. And again, the audio of this presentation will be available in the iTunes Store, and the audio and video will be available at attitudemag.com/webinars. So please post your questions. I know he's looking forward to them, and thank you again so much. Dr. Schultz, Linda says, this is the best webinar I've attended thus far, and the other ones have been terrific, so that says a lot. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday. Bye.
Bye-bye.